Good evening, everybody. So my name is Sharita Thompson, and welcome to tonight's program, At Issues, the Erasure of Black History. Now, before I introduce our distinguished guests for the evening, please join us on October the 8th at 7 p.m., another program at issue, the politicization of the FBI, featuring New York Times, FBI, and DOJ correspondent Devlin Barrett, and former FBI agent Michael Feinberg. So please come out and join us that day as well. Now, let's get to what we came here tonight for, and let me introduce our guest. We have former Georgetown University professor and current Presidential Pen Compact professor of Africana Studies at the University of Pennsylvania, Marcia Chatelain. She is the author of Southside Girls Growing Up in the Great Migration. They read it, okay. And she teaches about women's and girls' history, the U.S. Civil Rights Movement, as well as Black capitalism. Her latest book, Franchise, did you read that? Okay, all right. The Golden Arches in Black America, which examines the intricate relationship among African-American politicians, civil rights organizations, communities in the fast food industry, which received the 2021 Pulitzer Prize in History. She will be in conversation with Erica L. Green, who is a White House correspondent for the New York Times, covering the daily decisions, comings and goings in newsworthy events involving the president, the vice president, and other members of his cabinet. Green is particularly interested in social policy and civil rights, but covers a range of topics spanning domestic and foreign policy. Green joined the White House beat in the summer of 2023 and covered the last year and a half of the Biden administration, as well as the 2024 presidential campaign. Prior to that, she covered education. So please help me welcome our guests for the evening.
Thank you all. Whoa, okay. My regular voice. Okay, I cannot. Okay. Thank you all for coming tonight. Thank you for that lovely introduction. I am so honored to be in conversation on a very important topic. And I was listening to that bio, and it's so clear that I wrote that before this administration started. Because my job has been quite consumed with one man, and it has also been consumed with covering one of the most alarming and pressing issues of our time, which is the retrenchment of civil rights in this country, and the attempt to erase all evidence of this country's original sin. I did cover the first administration, the first Trump administration, and I covered Betsy DeVos because I was covering education. But, you know, I watched this kind of start when he was in office the first time around, and it was much more muted. It was much, I mean, there wasn't a lot of focus. He complained about the 1619 Project, created a 1776 commission, but, you know, thought it was not right to remove Confederate statues, but it wasn't, you know, a focus of his. It was kind of agitating people around him. And so I'm going to kick off our conversation by talking about my reporting over the last 8 months and how it culminated with a piece in the Times that laid, you know, out in painstaking detail the very deliberate efforts to erase Black history, which, you know, I didn't anticipate. And I was very, very, very careful because I didn't want to cry foul, or I didn't want to make accusations that weren't true. So I'm very fact-driven and evidence-based. And I will just say, you know, for good qualities for a journalist, and also I think, you know, you have to be really careful when you are are making assertions about people's intentions and their motivations, especially around race. So I don't use, the R word very often. And frankly, in the first term, there was a lot of deliberation around when we would call something racist or when we would decide that, an action that was being taken was racially, I think we said it on racially motivated or racially charged. This time around when I decided to stay on the White House beat, I had covered Kamala Harris's campaign in particular. I watched on the campaign trail, I watched the country begin to change. And I covered Harris. I went to her rallies. I was kind of immersed in her campaign. And at the end, I decided that I needed to go to a Trump rally because I needed to really understand what the rest of the country was like and what his supporters were like and what they wanted from him and what they looked to him for. And I went to one in Green Bay. And it was really, really revealing. So I would say I was not particularly surprised by the outcome. And I say that because the largest cheers came when they talked about transgender people and implications of race, DEI, so it was called. On Inauguration Day, I kind of knew what was coming when in the president's inauguration address, he vowed to return to a society that was colorblind and merit-based. And I said, okay. I was like, okay. Because that told me, if you're saying that in your inauguration address, you're saying it from the biggest megaphone and microphone, and not just the country but the world. You're going to stick to it. And the use of colorblind was also very telling for me. And I really do remember standing there watching it because, as we all know, there's never been a colorblind society. So I'll just take you through kind of a couple of turning points or markers along the way. We saw on the very first day in office the DEI executive order, which wasn't specific, but it just called anything having to do with diversity, equity, and inclusion divisive and harmful. So that was one. That was the one I was like, okay, here we go. And then we just started to see, there was an executive order to eliminate anything having to do with diversity, equity, and inclusion. DEI had been lobbed around as kind of a derogatory catch-all phrase for anyone, particularly when people didn't want to just say black. They would just say DEI, and that was even a derogatory term that was used against the vice president, as well as other black leaders before he took office. And so, the directive was for agencies to do this, and as I started to talk to federal workers in the weeks after, they were quite literally going through their websites and removing words like injustice and oppression and discrimination. And agencies really, they know what the order didn't say what to eliminate, right? But it was pretty loud and clear. It didn't need to be said. The military, when Pete Hegseth was confirmed and took office, and we all know his first town hall with his staff said that diversity was the dumbest phrase, or diversity is our strength is the dumbest phrase ever uttered in the military. And we started to see books purged from military-run or, schools that fall under Pentagon control. That was the second indication that that this was going down a path that was not just about, let's just say, it started to become crystal clear again what DEI meant, because they were only purging, Maya Angelou. They were purging any books that had to do with the history of racism in this country. And even still, I was like, okay, let me get some more. Let's just see what happens next. And I just was kind of compiling it all in a massive Google Doc. And then, the president stood and blamed a plane crash on DEI hours after it had happened, as people were still in the icy Potomac. And he said, when pressed in the briefing room, well, how do you know it was DEI? Well, he referenced a so-called policy that was passed under the previous administration, which, by the way, had been in place during his previous administration too, that, there was a directive to not hire white men, no white people. So I was like, okay. Example 3. And so I just kind of kept, I called that one out I wrote a story that just says, DEI is the President of the United States equated DEI with incompetence, which had a very racist undercurrent. And there was another marker. He had a Black History Month event at the White House, which I was shocked by. And I said to the White House, this violates your DEI order. Seriously, if you read it. And they said, well, no, we're not. No one's trying to erase Black history. No one. And I'm like, but the president stood and talked about all of these heroes, Harriet Tubman, that you are literally erasing from the government, right? That the federal government is no longer, recognizing. You scrubbed it. And so I was kind of building up to, and watching as Black history was slowly being erased. The experience of Black people in this country was being minimized, and frankly, not just minimized. It was being, it was like demeaned, right, as hateful and divisive and a stain on the country. And then I just, and I said, I'm going to write this story about, I was going to do this big story, just says like, Trump administration seeks to erase the Black experience. And I had this story all ready to go with just mounting evidence, right? And then on Juneteenth, he just said it, he just, I was sitting there, it's Juneteenth, and they held a White House briefing. They're like, this is just another working day for us. We work hard. We don't believe in taking days off. And no, really, and he, says nothing about the holiday, which is fine. And then posts a Truth Social post complaining that the holiday exists. And I said, okay, fine. I'm finally going to write this story. He finally just said it. And I think we had covered all of these stories, so many examples, but when you see it all in one place, it's quite overwhelming. And when you see it all in one place, you can't really come to any other conclusion, because they're not, removing books about the Holocaust. They're not removing books about other groups' experiences in America. It has been Black America. And that's just, a fact. And the White House hates to see me coming because they know I'm writing about this particular effort. And there's just kind of no way around it. And it's been, especially for military families, I will say it's been incredibly devastating. It's particularly painful for them. The Pentagon has been the most aggressive, I would say, of all of the agencies in eliminating so-called DEI. I will do a story on this soon. Black people have fought in every war since the very first one, and it's a source of pride that Black people have fought overseas for a country that denied them rights, and they have fought overseas for a country even when that country did not fight for them. And so I'm documenting something that is it's extremely painful. Not for me, but just for the Black community, for Black people who have, again, stood for democratic ideals for this country since forever. We've always kind of been the antithesis of the American. It's true. Like the existence in and of itself is a mirror for the country, and in talking to historians, they think that this is a particularly dangerous time to be erasing the history of Black people in this country for reasons that will be explained. So we've taken a really aggressive approach at the Times to document this for various reasons, because it's giving rise to kind of a propagandist version of history that we see not in democracies, which again I think you will hear. So I'll throw it to Marcia.
So thank you for that, Erica. It's funny. When I'm writing, and if I use racially charged or racially motivated, my editor says, no, just call it racist, because that's what it is. So as a historian, I enjoy the fact that I call a lot of things racist because they are. So I just want to do a little bit of kind of traveling back in time, because I think that what we are going through right now is retribution for two very key moments. One, the election of President Obama in 2008, and the summer of 2020. We are being punished for two moments that, when we think about the historical trajectory of African Americans or people of color, are small compared to the contributions of these communities, but the ability for an African American to inhabit the White House and the demands that were made during the George Floyd summer have motivated, I think, the majority of the things that we're seeing that are repressive, that are punitive, and that are dangerous. I will say that we know that a lot of the rhetoric around the punishments against higher education is under the pretense that it is a stand against anti-Semitism. I would argue that even those gestures that are supposed to be about protection are also punishment for the George Floyd summer of 2020, because I think in those two moments, for white supremacists, white nationalists, and their friends, they saw something in 2008 that was really upsetting. And it wasn't just that a Black person had strategized his way to the White House. It was that from that moment forward, the presidency, the White House, the nation's capital would have to be devalued. If we look historically at other examples, the one that I like to use is the fact that in the Isabel Wilkerson book, The Warmth of Other Suns, she talks about how people would migrate from the South and go to northern cities, and they're so excited because they can finally go into a bar and get a drink. The man orders a drink, he drinks his whiskey, and the bartender breaks the glass in front of him. We are in a moment in which the President of the United States wants to remind us that he is going to break the glass in front of us at every opportunity. So President Obama brought in a lot of, I think, hope and enthusiasm for a generation that were told that would never see a black president, including mine. I was told I would never see a black president or a Jesuit pope. And then I saw both, and I thought, oh boy, what's next, right? Those are two things. Growing up Catholic in the Midwest, there's never going to be a Jesuit pope, and then there was a black president. I couldn't believe it. But what being a historian has taught me is that any type of either substantive or symbolic representation of social change will come with a backlash. And I remember one of the first public events I did as a professor. I was at the University of Oklahoma during the election of 2008. I was in a very much a red state. And I said, I'm afraid that this is going to be, after the election of 1866, like this is, or 1877. I said, this is going to feel like 1877 in this country, if everything we know about this country is true. And some people said, well, we've moved on, things can get better. But understanding how backlash and political retrenchment works, it doesn't make us feel better about this moment, but it reminds us that the pendulum can swing. And so what I see is happening with the erasure of history is you have people who are deeply ignorant of a lot of things, but masterful at grievance and misinformation. And that's much more powerful than anything. I've read a bunch of books. That's nothing compared to the ability to lie and the ability to obfuscate, right? And so what has happened is people who are very much not affected by most of the things that have been signaled as progressive reforms are now becoming fighters and champions for an issue that does not impact them, right? I started my early career at the University of Oklahoma. Most of my students had never taken a course on African American history until they were 18, 19, 20 years old. That remains. But the number of pieces of legislation trying to outlaw and ban the teaching of African American history is at peak levels of something that wasn't even happening, right? This is how you were able to get colleges and universities to acquiesce based on populations of students of color, which have been the hyper minority since this school's founding, right? If you were to ask a person who's been filled with this misinformation for years, what percentage of Georgetown University or the University of Pennsylvania are African American? They would say, I don't know, 70, 80%, right? They would say, well, how many people, how many professors of color are at the Ivy Leagues? 30, 40, 50%? They would be shocked if they came on campus. But it doesn't matter. They have a stake in the belief that a political party or a set of political ideas can be part of the retribution. And so where we find ourselves now is in this really fascinating moment in which the attempt for the federal government to erase is not being done, can't be done in the same ways that it was done in the 19th century or even at mid-century. The amount of scholarship, the amount of people who know better, the amount of institutions that have been actually built on something solid still provides us the opportunity to say, well, that's not true. And if you're not going to teach this to my kids, I'm going to order this book, or I'm going to talk to people who know things, or I can watch this documentary. So now their backlash has to go into overdrive. It has to be more ridiculous. It has to be more odious. It has to, require the president to send someone into the Smithsonian to try to change things up, as if that is the only source of knowledge. I was interviewed on MSNBC a few weeks ago, and I said, the majority of Americans will never visit the Smithsonian. What are you talking about? But the more powerless, economically unstable, the more exhausted we are with endless wars, the more susceptible we are to this idea that our power can come from supporting a political machinery that is going to get the ruler out and start, slapping everyone's hands. This is all a fantasy, right? But it's a powerful fantasy. And that just because it's morally bankrupt and just because it defies logic doesn't mean it's not something we have to be vigilant and organized against. And so I think that it becomes incredibly confusing. I teach incredibly bright college students who are just so confused as to what is happening. And I think about it, I have a kid in preschool, and I think to myself, when I talk to him about certain periods of time, will it even be legible to him? There was a 5-year period that every other week, every other day, I was at schools talking about the importance of African American history. I was talking to teachers about how to be more culturally responsive and more sensitive to the needs of their students from different backgrounds. That world will be unfamiliar to my son if this continues. He'll think I'm making it up, right? That's like when my mother says, back in the 70s, you could just hitchhike and people would pick you up and not murder you. I'm like, that didn't happen. Never happened, right? But this is where we're headed, right? And so I say this to remind you that this is not just the kind of workings of an administration. This has been the work of the United States at different moments. And one of the things that I think when you talk about the DEI orders, which I thought was really fascinating, there are certain moves that this administration makes that are supposed to be, that are presented as for the followers and for the supporters, but I think they're also I think they are also intriguing and alluring to a segment of the population that has also been fooled by a lack of knowledge about the past. So the person in your office who complains about diversity training, they are served by this anti-DEI thing too. Now they may not like Trump and they may not like what he's doing, but the changes that people were demanding in 2020 and the small gestures of corporations and universities, it didn't just exhaust the far right. It also started to needle people on some parts of the left and other liberals. I hear the most disgusting things as a person who works at an Ivy League school, and I'll tell you one of them that I heard. Someone said, well, it's so terrible that the federal government is in the business of trying to ban international students, kidnapping them without cause, revoking their visas, and creating this chaos. But, some of the parents said that it might be easier to get into the schools this year. Some of you have heard this, some of you. And so, that's just what it is. Yeah. So who does that serve? In some way. It's not just for the voters. It's for a desire to shift a kind of orientation to justice, an orientation to immigrants, an orientation to African Americans. I hate what the president's doing, but I didn't really like all this talk about racism and white supremacy. Weren't we just done with that? And so, I work at a place with very smart people. And the second that executive order comes down, people are asking about websites. Are you kidding me? Right? No one is more confident or self-assured than an Ivy League professor. But here I am engaged in ridiculous conversations about whether the word equity is a problem, whether we can talk about injustice or we can talk about disparity. The very foundation, right, of intellectual inquiry is to question the ways that dominant structures have presented ideas and use facts and research to challenge it. But in this type of bullying climate, where the question is, do I challenge this order or do I have no money for my graduate students? Do I challenge this ideology or do I see the people who make less money than me have no job? And I'm not saying that these are easy decisions to make, but once we entertain any of this, we come to a place where we start to believe that it can also serve our needs. And this is why we have to be so explicit and say, I do not like this. I do not want to participate in this. I recognize everyone's vulnerability, but we have to call it what it is. Many times it's extortion, many times it's exploitation, and it's bullying. And I think the thing that is amazing about people, but is also a challenge, is we can actually adapt to a lot of different conditions. Many of us could not imagine, right, ever thinking about complying with things that we now are vigilant about because we don't want to harm our neighbors. And that's the best human instinct. But once we all draw a line and say, this is ridiculous, this is too much, and we say that to the other people at work, and we say that people to our neighbors, they start to say, you know what, you're right, this is too much. And the best thing that we have available to us to start thinking in this ways are fact-based histories, right? The work of scholars who said, well, how do you decide that you're not going to take a bus one day and it goes for 355 days, right? How do you decide that maybe your kids shouldn't go to school that day because you want to prove a point about this unfair and unjust system of schooling? You know, when do we decide these things? And so that is what they're afraid of, right? They don't like people of color. They don't like people who are different. They don't like that. But what they also know is that in that moment when we were all locked down during COVID and people were reflecting on the dangers of a single narrative and the dangers of false history, what did people want to do? They wanted the Confederate memorials out. They wanted to be more thoughtful and kind to each other, and they wanted to use the nation's history as a starting point to be better. And they could not have that happen. Because for that to happen, then all of their other indignities would have to be exposed. And so keeping us ignorant and keeping us hostile towards each other is the top agenda item, and they will try anything to do it. And so we now have a responsibility, I think more so than ever, to actually be in community, talk to each other. You know, the thing that we're going to talk about, you know, kind of some practices, but, you know, we have to write our stories down, record each other, take an oral history, because I think the greatest thing that I am afraid of is that no one, that in the future someone will say, well, you know, people in this time, they kind of like this. No one was really upset about this. You know what I mean? Get an extra flyer, keep it in a, you know, archive quality box in your attic so someone knows that there were flyers saying that this is wrong. At the sign you made at the No Kings protest, put that away somewhere so that someone can see it and can actually believe that there were some people who acted with integrity and with some moral reason. This is the moment to do that. Many of you are already doing it. Do more of it, because we need it so desperately.
You forgot one thing. Call your favorite reporter and tell them. Tell them what you're seeing and what your thoughts are. Go and on the record, please, with your name. No, I just want to just say that's sparked two things for me. I mean, there are real world consequences for this. I mean, and it is playing out particularly in schools. I'm going to put my education reporter hat on here. I mean, the administration, I mean, and I keep focusing on the DEI order because it's from which all other things have flowed. You know, the administration is going after colleges. Sure, they're getting the most attention, but K-12 schools that if they have programs for Black children or any other minority group, threatening their funding if they do not disband them. They are, I mean, I'm from Baltimore City. My kids attend a Baltimore City school. They're under investigation for anti-Semitism right now, which is, I won't get into, but that has been used against a lot of institutions that the administration has wanted to go after for one reason or the other. But you know, the threat of losing federal funding is real, and there are schools that are adjusting their practices. They are dropping their African American studies classes. They are removing Ruby Bridges books from their libraries. I mean, they just cannot afford to lose federal funding. You know, and for kids, I mean, I'm the mother of two, and I my husband is Jewish, and I have had to have a conversation with my children about why mommy's history is divisive and harmful and daddy's is not, right? So so there is, it is, yes, a lot of it feels performative, but the reframing of history is reverberating. It really is, and it will look different for the next generation. And I personally think that there will be damage done that might be beyond repair. Watch the Smithsonian. The president visited the African American History Museum in 2017. Loved it. Wanted to stay longer. Said it was a painful reminder of the bigotry and hatred that the country faced. And this time around, he wants to get rid of all of the exhibits that
eggs weren't $9 back then.
Huh?
Eggs weren't $9 back then.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Like.
So it'll be very interesting to. Lonnie Bunch was just at the White House last week. We still don't know what happened, but when we do, we'll let you know. He still has a job, so that was encouraging. But it will be really, it'll be fascinating to see as they take their inventory of what they need to purge, what will stay and what will go.
Can I also say something though about that? Just to be very, this is the only time I'm going to be fair. The Smithsonian has always been a site of political battles over the presentation of history. So this is not unprecedented in the sense that people have to be very careful about how they tell the nation's story. And I say that because the suggestion that anything reckless would happen at the Smithsonian is so irritating to me, because it is such a the people at the Smithsonian are so thoughtful. They are always aware of the political climate, no matter who's in the White House.
They tailor their art.
They have a lot of pressure from Congress and the public. This is not a kind of a discovery that all of a sudden they've discovered all of these problems and they're going to target the museums. The museums have always been fighting for their academic freedom, their independence, and they've always had to be sensitive to their funding source. But I think that what bothers me about some of the show of it, and I think you're absolutely right, withholding federal funding is one of the most powerful strategies actually in the enforcement of civil rights. So It's very interesting how a lot of groups like this, they read a lot of civil rights when they need to find ways to enact their agendas. So not only is the implication that the White House has the power to do this, but this is the continuation of the needling of the federal worker as inept, as wasteful, and without value. And that's the thing that's kind of interesting. It's kind of like the military thing. The military built its brand of anti-communism by suggesting that it can make inroads to race relations. Now that the Cold War is over, and now that we are engaging in a different kind of political posturing around the world, an all-white military becomes very appealing to certain sensibilities. So I think it's really interesting the way that these institutions have always been manipulated, and that someone has obviously read a few books because they're using that in order to enact a new kind of image of America.
According to the president, I'm just keeping my journalistic hat on. His issue, if you haven't seen, with the Smithsonian and the African American History Museum, is that all it does is talk about how bad America is, and this is a quote, and how bad slavery was. So I put that in my Google Doc too. So he has very, if you're noticing a pattern here, this isn't just to focus on the he says it. He pinpoints very particularly what it is that bothers him about whatever issue is bothering him at the moment, which changes a lot in one day. But on this issue...
Which is an opinion that I think a lot of Americans hold. That one I won't put on him entirely, and I like to put a lot of crap on him, but that one I don't think that is that far off than some of the sentiments and attitudes towards the presentation of the history of slavery that has been presented across a lot of eras. You know, I worked at Georgetown when they were trying to have a better grasp of their history of slavery. A lot of people kind of had that energy.
They were like, over it.
Or like, why are we doing so much of it? It's endless. It's so you see, there's a kind of slippage between some of the things he says, and I think a lot of dominant attitudes about race. And this is why some of this is working,
especially since 2020. So we were going to talk about the responsibilities of the press in this moment.
We were exhausted.
It's been a day,
but grateful for everyone's
presence. Yes, thank you. I'm glad I could be here. Yeah, I mean, look, for the press, you know, I have felt as a reporter an immense, you know, I always feel an immense sense of responsibility, but I feel, you know, purposeful, and I feel the weight of the moment. I really do, to document in my Google Doc. And then on the pages of the New York Times, no, seriously, I really feel a responsibility to meticulously and diligently and doggedly document every single turn that we see, because I do believe that, you know, in 30 years, I do want my children to read the historical record of the New York Times and any other publication and understand how the world that they are living in came to be. I do, you know, feel like this is, and you would know this better than I, but, you know, we've kind of seen this before. I'm actually going to write a story soon, or publish a story soon, about, you know, what happened during the Woodrow Wilson presidency. You know, the resegregation of the workforce. You know, this is, yes, it's DEI, yes, it's the Smithsonian, yes, it's, you know, this kind of whack-a-mole hits here and there, but this is all connected. And we see it even, and I did a recent piece about just the number of Black women leaving the workforce in the last 5 months, or over a 5-month time span. You know, it was 319,000 Black women. The federal government has long been a ladder to the middle class for Black America. It was one of the only places that Black Americans could get white-collar jobs, pay equity, and that was particularly true for Black women. 300, and they're highly concentrated in a lot of the agencies that have been targeted in this administration. 319,000 from February to July. At the same time, white men gained 365,000 jobs, right? You know, and when I reached out to the White House for comment for this story, the first line of the response was doing away with DEI policies that contributed to a bloated government, or in a bloated bureaucracy. And so I just think, you know, it is imperative to continue to tell these stories. You know, after Woodrow Wilson decimated the workforce, segregated the workforce, it wiped out economic progress for Black people for generations. There are studies that actually have studied the economic prosperity, or lack thereof, of the descendants of Black Americans who worked in the federal government at that time, and they did not recover. And so I think we just, you know, in this moment, reporters have to call it. It's not racially tinged. It's not racially charged. It's not racially motivated. It is or it isn't, right? And also it's important because there's so much to take in every day or every month. You know, I think we have a responsibility to connect the dots too, right? Not just so and so said this today, such and such agency did this today. I think, you know, I've held myself to every 3 months. You know, you just have to pull it all together, because like I said, when I covered, you know, the library purge or the purging of DEI staffers from the government, or the, you know, erasing certain stories from military websites or Arlington. Those were, you know, people read those stories and they were like, oh man, that's the latest thing. But when I put it all in 3 paragraphs, it hit differently, you know? And so you can just start to see the pattern. And we also have a responsibility, I think, to document what is being erased. I will say, like, I, as a reporter, was affected by this when I was reporting the story on the Black workforce and what was happening, and you know, particularly with Black women. Once I saw that trend start to emerge, I was using federal data. There was a whole database on the Office for Personnel Management website. It was amazing, and it was a treasure trove. It was called Diversity Cube. But it really was a treasure trove of like pay data, salary, promotion. It had everything. I mean, it compared across groups, and I was just like, oh, this is incredible. I started that story in February, and I had, you know, I save all of my as I research, I save all of my links, and so I can remind myself, because I'm usually working on so many different things at once. I went back to that website in April, and it was gone. It was gone. 404, you know, the big error message. And my stomach dropped. I mean, I could not, as a reporter, I'm like, I never even could imagined that it could happen, that the information that I need could not be there as a journalist. And luckily for me, an organization had downloaded all of that data, the National Women's Law Center, I will say it, they had just so happened to be doing their own research, and they're real like research data people. So they were of the mind to download all of that data from the federal government's website, and they had it, or I would not have been able to get that information. And they will never, and they have confirmed that they will not publish that again. So this isn't just like, you know, whether an exhibit on slavery is going to be there in the next 4 years, or et cetera. Like this is also the erasure of historical record, you know, and it has happened before. It's a historical record of a backlash against people of color that, you know, we've seen in times of progress. I mean, that's just, I'm not editorializing, that's just a fact. And you know why I know that? Because I can go and read history, and, you know, but will a reporter in 50 years be able to go and do that? I don't know.
I mean, listen, the issues that you raise are so important, because I think technology becomes a blessing and a curse. So with the technology, we can download documents, we can screenshot things, we can create a new archive, right? Paper is going to be our friend again. And at the same time, the accessibility of data makes us believe that, like, you know, a cloud or a fairy makes this, but it's people, it's researchers who need the funding, who need the time, who need the work to do this. And, you know, someone in higher education, I always say that we have to understand higher education is for the public good, not just the people who work there or go there, because no matter who you voted for, you can get cancer. No matter who you voted for, you need safe cars on the road. No matter who you voted for, you need beautiful pieces of art to look at and music to listen to. And a lot of that happens in our nation's universities, right? So when we start to suggest that federal work is just for lazy people who don't who don't have talents. Universities are just for annoying liberals like me to have jobs and indoctrinate kids. Once we start kind of buying into those fantasies, when these things are stripped and taken away, we don't realize what we're losing. And I think the articulation of when you do not have DEI offices that are trying to recruit and open up talent, you don't get astronauts, you don't get physicists, you don't get doctors who are working in underserved communities. You don't have a whole cadre of people who are rethinking knowledge and rethinking professions. Good luck with that. Because when you have a heart attack, I hope that you have a clinician that had the opportunities to actually care, right, for you, regardless of your color. And so I think that all of these issues are about a fantasy of individualism that none of us can indulge in. We don't need a federal government. Yes, we do. We don't need public schools. Yes, we do. And so I think that the last thing I will say is, in terms of seeing these patterns and cycles, there wasn't a crackdown on public benefits and welfare until court cases said that you can't discriminate against poor people in the access of these very benefits. We didn't have these kind of purges of welfare cheats until after the Civil Rights Act of '64 and the opening of benefits on an equal basis. We didn't have a backlash to higher education until higher education was considered a space where people were challenging authoritarianism and wars overseas and the question of equality, right? Everything's fine until it's a challenge. But ultimately, what we all lose out on, right, is the capacity to live better quality of lives. And so I think that in our advocacy, we have to not just use history as an indicator of how things can go. We also have to remind each other the things we need in order to be a stable society. Because the whole plan is to make us as unstable as humanly possible, continue to manipulate us, and believing that private sector contracts are going to get us out of here. I have yet to see that happen. But here we are. And so our ability to be able to be very specific about what's happening and put a historical context on it, I think makes us stronger in getting our neighbors and getting our families and communities in a space where we can feel productive to fight it.
Okay, so, whoa. Let's thank Marcia Chatelain and Erica Green once again. And we're going to have an opportunity to open up for just a few questions. Now, wait till the mic comes to you, but if you have a question, please raise your hand. And we'll go here and here, just because it's short.
So you left out a couple things on your on the attacks of history, so I just wanted to briefly mention them. One is the obvious one. They went after the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, which is they kind of framed it as going after bad news, but everyone knows that most of the content on those on PBS stations is history. Especially there was a great one on the Great Migration last year. So I want to mention that. And while the Trump administration hasn't done it, there has been Holocaust books that have been removed from schools, so I wanted to mention that. The Mouse is the one that comes to mind, so I wanted to mention that as well.
Thank you. All right, question here.
I actually had two items that I wanted for you to speak on, if possible. The first one you mentioned, as far as Trump, obviously, changing from his first administration approach to now. And one of the major changes, of course, is as far as the Heritage Foundation and Project 2025, and basically the influence of these other organizations, this shadow government that's going on. So if you can speak to that. And then the other thing, I know that you obviously, spoke about the universities and, institutions like the Smithsonian, but is part of the answer actually to shift more to privatization as far as whether it's museums, et cetera? For example, the Hobby Lobby guy, was the one behind the museum, the Bible Museum. Do we need more of that as far as to preserve Black history?
I will just, about museums, it's interesting. So they're, the kind of defunding that they're doing, I assume that they had all these contractors lined up to pick up the work. It doesn't seem like they have that. So they're halfway there and creating the kind of, destabilized economy that, grows neoliberalism. In terms of museums, museums are tricky because they require a huge amount of capital investment, even the most modest museum. What they've done is, so they're doing the attacks on the Smithsonian and they're making that the kind of smoke and mirrors, but they've also just pulled grants from small cultural organizations that use, $10,000 to the Smithsonian isn't big money. $10,000 to a local kind of preservation society, a local archive is huge. Those grants, a lot of those have been pulled. They've been called DEI. Even things that don't even touch the areas that we think are DEI are now DEI, so they're gone. But I think also in tandem, it's interesting that the targets are the elite institutions, the big state schools, right, where they can make the most mess, the public schools where they can try to bring in PragerU and all of this, kind of inaccurate content. But another part of it also is the return of the Confederate names on the military bases. I think that also kind of plays into this idea that the traditions and policies that were kind of created at mid-century, just so you know, we can erode that too. Because the military was always that place where affirmative action policies, even when the Supreme Court was gutting affirmative action, they said, hey, this is like national security, let's not mess with this too much. So in many ways, people who were civilians didn't realize the way that the military was still invested in the same way as corporate America and higher ed wasn't. But by doing that, I think they're also saying, it's over everywhere, and it's no longer a threat to, or who cares about kind of global security.
And yes, the administration's makeup has definitely made a huge difference this time around, very heavily, Project 2025, very heavily Heritage Foundation, as you say. The president also has in his ranks, people who are very influential and who have made it very, very clear that they believe that the country, that the tip of the country, as toward majority minority, is a problem. There are people in this administration who have literally said that the country, that things need to be run by competent white men. There are influential people in his administration who believe that, white men have been the victims of civil rights laws. I mean, they say this. I'm not, I'm careful to stick to what I know, and that I know. We just had a story on this administration being, packed with people with white nationalist ties. And so yes, there are people in the orbit this time around who are either far more influential than they were the first time, like Stephen Miller, and then there are people in the orbit who weren't here the last time around, who have been, studying and making plans and writing plans to execute for decades. So that's the difference. And it's so interesting because people get so confused about what the president really believes about race. First of all, you should, if you haven't read Confidence Man by Maggie Haberman, I highly recommend it, because his history with race goes back to decades. When I was reporting the Black History Month story, which they were really, really upset about for some reason, that he was having a Black History Month event while also canceling Black History Day. They didn't love that story, but he had like Tiger Woods at the White House.
He had him in the proclamation. It was so weird.
Listen, so he was like, they were like, but he loves like athletes. Like he stood on stage and just like, was like Michael Jordan, and we're gonna like put up a statue of Kobe, and like people were cheering. It was packed, by the way. Well, it was packed. The Black History Month event was packed, so I'll just leave that there. But like, you know, he likes to, you know, really focus on the argument is that he wants to focus on Black progress, but so that's the argument that I have gotten from the White House. But as I said to them, and as I've said in stories, on the flip side, he wants to celebrate Black progress while at the expense of minimizing Black pain. So yeah, I think, you know, he is the administration's makeup. I mean, this administration came in ready, infinitely has been really effective. You know, for better or worse, depending on where you stand. But it is heavily stacked with people who believe that 2020 was a tipping point. We needed to rein this stuff in, that there was too much focus on race. What they really mean is there was too much focus on Black people, and that, you know, they needed to right size the ship.
One more question. I've been living the last 3 months like everybody, but my mind keeps going back to the Reconstruction period and how we...
Mine too.
Yeah, it's just... And so my other question is, what proactive activity that we can do to... It taps on your question. Where do we go? Where do we go? Where do we go?
So one of the incredible hallmarks of that period after the end of Reconstruction, you know, roughly 1877 to about 1945, is the unbelievable ways in which African Americans particularly, but other communities, were able to institution build in the absence of the protection of the vote, economic stability, and access to education, right? So all of these things were not available, and people were still able to build up groups like, you know, Carter G. Woodson's group that's now, I think, one of the sponsors of this group, right?
Association for the
Study of African American Life and History. You know, we have the establishment of the NAACP and the Urban League, and, you know, later CORE will come into it. So people understood the rights that they did not have, and they understood the incredible power of people together in real life, right? They did not have the internet to drain their brain away. They had to meet in person to talk about what is the strategy, what is the plan. And if you look at the history of these organizations, they understood also the importance of celebrating literary accomplishments and history, and also being really vigilant about legislation, about policy change, and about lobbying. This is all we have, right, is our brain and people power in this moment. I mean, I think that we have seen incredible challenges, legal challenges to this administration. I think we have a huge problem in the Supreme Court, but that's for another discussion. But we've seen the ways that people have asserted and reminded each other of what we actually do have. And I think about this period of time, especially, you know, Black women's organizations, people who are, you know, can't even imagine a world in which their vote is respected, can't imagine the kind of economic independence that many people still have, and they are still kind of organizing at this incredibly smart and careful level. And I think that is what we're seeing in DC. People, like, as part of the Free DC movements and local groups, people are organizing in ways that I don't think they could ever imagine they would, because we see what is needed, right? And it's people together on the ground, whether it's walking kids to school or reporting ICE kidnappings, right? Like, and banging pots at 8 o'clock. Like, these things may feel small in a world that is so evil right now, but I have seen incredible things from people who never talk to each other, who are neighbors and now comrades because they understand the importance of their presence. And I think that has always been a historical fact.
Support your newspapers. Support your local I assume you all live in DC, but if there is a local newspaper in another part of the country that you like to read, or you moved here from somewhere, support your local paper, support your public broadcasting and PR, support institutions who are trying to bring you the truth. And I will just tell you, as someone who has covered, a lot on this is a tough topic to cover. Not because I'm Black, but because it's tough to cover. And so it just as if I were covering, if I were covering the immigration right now, I don't even know what shape I would be in. So if you ever feel compelled to send a note to a reporter that you think is doing a good job, do so, because it really does actually mean a lot when we are in the depths of stories, of reporting really difficult truths, to know that people appreciate it. And it's always been nice to have, but the ones I get now are very different than, and I've been I know I look young, but I have been a journalist for 17 years. So yeah, I would just say, I would please support the people who are trying to document this incredibly remarkable moment in our democracy and our history. And also, I'm a big believer in self-care. Just turn it off if you need to.
Thank you so much. Now, we are ending the program, but I think our ladies are going to stick around for a few minutes. So if you want to ask them a question, go up and ask a question. I think they're going to stick around for a few more minutes, so you can do that. Thank you all for coming this evening. Have a good one.